It's not quite right.
Swap displays.
Which is?
The icon, the third icon from the left on the top there.
Got it. Is that better?
Yes, sir.
Great. All right. So, it's not our first time doing this. So, again, if you can keep self muted and ask questions in the chat. I believe Manolo is doing the moderation tonight, so he'll be gathering your questions. I got a couple spots in to where we can stop and do that. I would be remiss if I didn't start out with one of these. I could do this for a long time. I got a bunch of them. So I actually did want to take a step back and actually pick this up from the end of chapter 4 of Ephesians. And obviously can't go through everything in depth, but there's a couple things I did want to point out. And as we go through this, I got some color coding, and just pointing out some of the points that Paul is bringing up. He talks about not letting unwholesome talk come out of our mouths and getting rid of bitterness and rage and anger. It's not totally clear if this letter was written to to be passed around a group of churches. Was there a particular problem with this, or was this just something that he thought needed to be shared generally? We're not really sure. What I want to point out though is the ways that he responds to that, and that some of the other things he says: building others up, may benefit those who listen, kind and compassionate, forgiving, and just listen for the sort of the patterns that come through here. Continuing on, follow God's example, walk in the way of love, but also the way of love, just as Christ loved, he gave himself up. Among you, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality. So this section's a little bit different. It's still sort of he's giving them a directive. So somewhat different here. And one of the things I wanted to mention here is the second part I highlighted there is he's connecting these behavior, immorality, impurity, and greed. And sometimes we forget greed in that grouping. These are idolatry. That can help sort of why are what's wrong with these things? It's putting the wrong things as God. But also as he's talking about these things, he says, instead of that, Thanksgiving's been mentioned again. And then here at the end, he's talking about, don't partner with these people, leading up to, well, who should we partner with? And that's, I think, gonna play into some of what we talk about a little bit later as well. This part in here, again, have nothing to do with these, with these fruitless things. But at the same time, there's this passage about, everything, this interesting thing of everything exposed to the light becomes visible. Of course, that's how light works, but also stuff that is illuminated also becomes a light. So there's this pattern here of light makes things visible, and then those things make light, and then light makes things visible, and so there's this sort of this cycle here of making more and more things visible, making more and more things what they should be as light instead of what they shouldn't be as darkness. Again, be careful how you live. Don't be foolish. Don't get drunk on wine, but also speak to one another, sing and make music. One of the things once we can finally meet together again, we better have a time where we just sing until people have to go home. Because these things, these are, these bring us together. These, these help us. Giving thanks. It's the third time I think that he's mentioned, thanks or thanksgiving in this whole section. So this sort of introductory part here for chapter 5, and really, you go back through some of chapter 4 as well. It seems to me anyway that there's the same sort of pattern. It's not like he's going through a checklist, but Paul is giving, here's a bunch of behaviors that he's cautioning people about, warning people about, and they're kind of all over. There's all sorts of different things that he's talking about, but at the same time, over and over again, the things that keep coming up are unity and compassion and support and bearing with one another, forgiveness. And so I think it's interesting that as he goes through all of these different things that don't necessarily seem related, the things that keep coming up are these community, support, partnership kinds of words. And I say all that to say, there's we're going to talk about a section that talks about some different roles and some different things. That's the part I want us to focus on, is all of these things continue to echo through that whole discussion. And I think it can help us make sense of what it is that he's trying to say. So I'm not going to read through this section completely. We'll go through it kind of piece by piece. As we talk through it, I think most of us are at least somewhat familiar with this particular passage. But like I said, I wanted to set it up with that's how it comes up in the discussion of the letter itself, is after all of these other things. And so, like I said, I think that informs what he's trying to do in the language, in the language that he's using in there. So I did want to contrast this. The section we're going to talk through is basically it's a household code. There's also one mentioned in Colossians, similar in some ways, different in other ways. But there's other examples that we have of household codes from ancient times. This is one from Aristotle, and I mentioned to say there are some there's some definite differences. There's some similarities as well. The specific relationships that are being talked about of a husband, a father, and what is he called? A master over slaves. Those are the same sort of roles that are picked out in Ephesians. However, it's a very different style of thing here. There's and this is one of the things I was reading through. I had this quote. I think this is important for us to see. We've seen this, we've seen this passage so many times. It's easy to forget and have trouble thinking of it. How would they have heard it in that day? And the thing is what Paul is writing is very striking and very different from the way that the culture of the time was talking about a household. And the thing that's new is not necessarily what we see as new or challenging, but it's as this quote says, the Christian limitations being placed on the head of the household. That's what would have stood out at the time as this is different, this is radical. So So as we go through the section, I think this is how the section starts out. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's kind of bookended later. We'll talk about that sort of as we go through. And I will do apologize as we're going through this. There's a couple of pieces where I'm going to come back to a couple of things. It just didn't necessarily fit together well to do it all sort of at the same time. So apologize for that. But I think this is a sort of the overarching statement of this whole section. And it is, this is a powerful idea that there's, is not just one side submit to the other, but that there's, the term I'm going to keep coming up, keep coming back to is partnership, unity, together, supporting each other. That's what this is supposed to, that's what this is supposed to represent. And there's a lot that we could discuss in this. And there's things that we just, I think unfortunately we just don't have time in this setting to go through. You have questions, about certain pieces of this from the, what about this, or what about this, or what about this, or I've read this. I'd be happy to talk talk about that and answer those questions. It's just hard to do that in, any reasonable amount of time in this setting. So this starts out with a statement to wives. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do so to the Lord. For the husband's the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also the wives should submit to their husbands in everything. So a couple things that I'll point out here, and a couple different commentaries mention this. It's the wording there is, it really is submit yourself. This is supposed to be willing. Like I said, this is a partnership. This is not, you're supporting somebody. You're trying to help them. You're working with them. That's the attitude. And PowerPoint's being odd. Sorry. A couple things that I point out some things that aren't being said sometimes as well. And I think the question the question asked is, okay, it said as the church submits to Christ, what does that look like? How do we submit? How does the church submit to Christ? And what can how can that speak to you in whatever situation you're in? What would Jesus do in, how did Jesus react to different things? How did he respond to different things? How was he with God? What, those kinds of things, I think can help us as well. So this is, one thing I did want to point out, and the word here, the word here is submit. It's not obey is a different word. In the, there's a later section we'll go through where it says obey. What's different about it? Again, I think obey is something I do because I have to. Submitting is, okay, I'm connected to this particular person. I care about you. I care about what you care about. I'm going to make a decision to support you, and not just, well, I have to do this, so I'm going to. I think that's the difference that that I'm focusing on anyway. And I will point out, I mean, the culture at the time, this was like, why are you even writing this, Paul? This is, of course, everybody else. There's not any other choice. but still he's saying, don't just do what you're expected to do. There's got to be a willingness. There's got to be a, sort of a humility even of that. Point this out as well. It's submit yourself to your own husband. I think sometimes I'm not sure this has always been treated as well as it could be. And I again do want to say, I know this has been mentioned before. This cannot be an excuse for abuse. So, all right, what does submission look like? So I want to mention the passage in Philippians 2. We're familiar with this, but a couple things I want to point out. This is Jesus, and it says here, who being in very nature God, that Jesus was God. And exactly how does that work? I don't know that we have the way to describe it, but Jesus could have said, no, we're equal. I'm not going to submit to you. But he didn't do that. He didn't consider equality with God. This is, I think, slightly different translation than some of us may have heard before. It's not something that he could to use to his own advantage. He could have said, I'm the Son of God. Don't you know who I am? And yet he took on the nature of a servant. And I think sometimes we think, he took on the nature of a servant, he died on the cross. No, he was born as a squishy human. He was in heaven. He was with God. He created the universe. He was with God as God created the universe. And he said, make me like one of them. And that's how Jesus, that's how submissive Jesus was to God's plan. And it's not exactly how it was worded in the verse, but I think these kind of ideas of it's easy, it's easy as humans. We want to be, we want to be treated a particular way. We want to be recognized. We want to be, hey, I'm like that too. And that's not the example we have. Wives or husbands, quite frankly, that's not the example we have from Jesus. But I think, when these things come up, this is a passage that I think we can go to think about. So there's a couple sections throughout here. It's my opinion. I think submission can't mean or shouldn't mean that you can't express your thoughts or concerns or your opinion or whatever, even criticism. There's a good way to do it and maybe a not so good way to do it, but that should be okay. It shouldn't mean that one person always gets their way. I think that's not what that's not the point of that. I've heard this described this way before of, this means that the husband gets a tiebreaker vote. And I'm not really here to agree or disagree with that statement. I think it's the wrong way to think about it. I think it's just the wrong picture to have. And this is something I'll talk a little bit more later as well. But like I said, I just think it's the wrong way to think about it. So it's not a bad spot to stop for questions. Anything in particular that came through?
Well, there is a question. You mentioned that submission does not mean obedience. That needs some clarification. And one of the questions related with that is, for example, in the example of Jesus that you gave, you said that he submitted to God's will. And the Philippians one that you mentioned there does say that he was obedient. So he obeyed to God's command. Obedience is not necessarily simply what you have to, you can also willingly obey. Having said that, the question of submission and to one another and to obedience is with a question of government. When it says that submission in relationship to one another differing somehow on how we are to submit to government, for example. So kind of that relationship between obedience and submission.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't have a great answer for it, to be honest. The word that's translated submit is to place yourself under. And there's certainly some overlap between that and obey. I just think, Paul's a smart person, and he had the choice of all of these particular, like he could have said obey, and in the household code that I had earlier from Aristotle, it does say obey. It says obey for across the board there. So I do think he's calling out that it is different. But like I said, I don't have a great answer for what is that different. I think it's something we have to something we have to think about and consider. I do think part of it may be the mindset. It may not be, but I do think it's a different, he used a different word, and I think that's important.
I have a question.
A question. Okay.
So no, you can go. Sorry.
No, I was about to say there are no other questions, but if you have one, please go.
If I could add, if you have one, if you could put it in the chat, and then we'll have another break in a little bit.
Okay.
And we can come back to that.
Can I try to clarify what you were saying, Brian?
Sure.
Okay, obedience is like your child. If you tell you're 4 years old, go and say sorry, otherwise you're gonna get it. They will obey you, but in their mind, they are not really submitting. If you give them freedom of, I'm not gonna spank you, they won't do it. So submission, to put yourself under, means you are in agreement with what this person is doing, and whether there shouldn't be any spanking or anything. It's like you're totally humbling yourself because you agree and you want to help and you want to be in agreement. Then you will obey. It's like you want to be in agreement with this person because you see where they are coming from, compared to, if I don't do this, I'm gonna get it, so I may as well obey. That's my little.
Brian, unmute yourself if you, sorry.
Oh, you guys didn't hear me at all, right?
No, we heard you, Barnabas.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah, we heard you.
Oh. Brian, if you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, it hit itself and I couldn't find the button. So I know it's not like I program computers for a living. Okay, so the next little piece I wanted to talk about, there's a metaphor that he uses in that section. He talks about as Christ is the head of the church, and I bring this up. I'm a little surprised that the amount of grammar things that I've explained during this session. My grade school English teachers would be, I'm sure, shocked. But he's explaining something as using an example. as a way to explain, you can understand this thing as because it's the same as this other thing. And the thing I would ask is, this idea of, Jesus the head of, head of the church, husband the head of the wife. There's a lot written about this, and I don't want to get into this discussion right now. I think there's more to it than we really have time for. I don't want to just do something, sort of in passing. The thing I would say is, I think we can think about, how is Jesus the head of the church? In what ways is Jesus the head of the church? And those are things that we can think of. We can think through scripture. We can think through things in the gospel, things in other letters. What are some examples of how did Jesus act? How did he, what did he talk about? What did he do? What did he say we need to think about? How are we supposed to think about Jesus and his sacrifice and all these things? And I think that's helpful to think through when we're thinking about, how does this apply to my life? What is it supposed to what is it supposed to represent? And that's what I would ask everyone to think through. Just what are some of these things? I've got a link to an article in the end. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's been written about that. I think it would be good for us to come back and talk about it at some point. I just don't think this is the right time for that. So again, apologies for that, but I do think that's a question that we can think about. A couple things I did want to mention, just in when we hear that language. I did want to point out that we hear, we talk a lot of times about the difference between the head and the heart, and thinking versus emotions, and just wanted to point out that in ancient thought, I think this is generally applies as well to Jewish thought as well. Love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind is some of these different pieces. And I encourage you, go look those up. What are those, what are those, what's represented by those things? But generally the heart was actually thought of as the logic and thinking, to memorize something by heart. That's where that comes from. That's what, used to think, obviously it's not, correct as our understanding of biology now, but that's what they thought. That's what, that was the center of thought. The passage that, that says, Jesus was moved in spirit, the moved to compassion is like moved in his gut. It's a different, like the thinking with your stomach. And one of Paul's letters, he talks about their God is their stomach. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about making decisions and being ruled by our feelings and passions. So there is some differences in there. I mentioned this as well in talking about some of this submission and authority and how do we relate to this. I think this is a super important passage for us to remember, from Matthew 20. And it's interesting that this passage is like right before the crucifixion and right before the entry into Jerusalem. Just interesting that that's where this ends up being. But Jesus said, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So like I said, I one of the things I kind of want in when we're thinking about it, it's just easy to think who's in relation to who. And I'm not necessarily, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I just think this is what Jesus taught about leadership. This is what he taught about authority. He had authority. And later in Matthew, he has all authority. And yet he says, if you want to be great, if you want to be a leader, if you want these things, you've got to think about it in a different way. And so I think that, that, as well as, the passage that I mentioned earlier from Philippians, I think those two playing against each other of leadership and submission, I just think the example we get from Jesus is different than we usually think about those terms. And again, what I want to come back to is partnership. If you're a husband and wife, you're a partnership, and it's important for you two to work together instead of fighting against each other. So the husband part of the passage, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Again, how did Christ love the church? And gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. How does Jesus feed and care for us? For we are members of his body. So I point out the husband section is I think 10 verses compared to 3 or 4. Interesting that Paul has more to say to husbands than to wives. Husbands are commanded to love their wives. I'm sure it's also proper for wives to love their husbands. Why does that not need to be said? And the other way did. Maybe there's something about us that needs to be reminded of this. And like the quote I mentioned before, the striking thing is that this isn't just in that culture. The husbands could do whatever they wanted. We see in the story with the woman caught in adultery. Caught in adultery means there was more than one person there. The man wasn't in trouble. In Greek culture, adultery wasn't like a man can do that. He won't get in trouble. If a woman does, then that's not the same. So there's there's definitely cultural things going on there that he's saying, hey, it's not right for husbands to treat their wives this way. It's important for you to love them. It's important for you to treat them the way Jesus, the way Jesus takes care of us in the church. And I think that's important to remember. I'll throw this in. Just the example we see of Jesus. What are the things he did? How did he serve? What was he willing to do? It doesn't seem like there was a line that he wouldn't cross. Oh, I'm too good for that. He tied a towel around his waist and performed the duties of a servant. How are things divided? Certainly not going to say how that should or shouldn't be, but I think it's important to think about. Things with kids. I'll tell you, our general division of labor is I get education and my wife gets medical. So if someone's bleeding, they go talk to her. If you're having trouble with math, you come talk to me. That's just, you know, that's what, you know, I was a teacher. She's obviously a nurse. But I just think, you know, it's important it's important to be involved, and for this to, you know, to not be, you know, exactly what is fair is hard to figure out, but I think it's worth thinking about. Which is what I said there. So I mentioned the tiebreaker thing before. A couple things sort of related to that. I think, you know, I got this from a thing Gordon Ferguson did. You know, he talked about, you know, for minor decisions, you say, you know, what's your choice and how important is it to you? You know, number 1 through 10. I'd like to, you know, I'd like to do this, and I'm a 4. The other person says, I'd like to do this, and I'm a 7. Well, it's more important to you. Let's go with that. You know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for everything. It's, you know, it's important. You know, like I said before, I think it's important that all of those don't go a particular way. And you know, I think some of these things are maybe obvious, but I feel like sometimes these things get missed. I actually put this one in as a reminder for myself. This can be me sometimes. I tend to drop hints, and it's not super effective. So don't do that. And you know, listen and respect. I think those are all always important. So the tiebreaker thing. I mean, basically, it comes down to. I mean, there's only, you know, if you have a husband and wife, that's 2 votes. If the husband gets an extra vote, then there's never a vote. It's always what the husband wants. And I don't think that's in line with, you know, with the other passages we've talked about. And I just don't think it's right. You know, again, some of these may be, you know, maybe extreme examples, but like I said, I just think the framing is just, I think the framing is wrong. And I think it's easy for, you know, oh, I wouldn't do that, but it comes out in other, you know, in other examples. And you know, I think, you know, you can sort of come up with these hypothetical, well, you know, what if you know, if you get a bunch of advice and you know, and it all lines up like perfectly even, what do you do? You know, I'm not saying you can't think of it. I'm not saying you know, you can't do this if this is how you know, want to make decisions in your, you know, in your marriage. Okay, I just think, you know, like I said, I think it's the wrong framing. And I feel like if for a major decision, you know, if it's not a consensus of the 2 of you together, I just think it's going to cause problems. So I'd be happy to. There's actually some examples of that from, you know, from Chris and I that I can talk through. So if you want more information about that, you can ask at the end. But anyway, that's sort of my thing with the tiebreaker idea. All right, so wrapping up the husband and wife piece. You know, I didn't want to say that. I do feel like this is a passage that, you know, sometimes this is brought up, and you know, it's just, it's not good how we take it. I think sometimes it's used as a club, and it's just, that's not, you know, all of the language about it is, you know, humility and, you know, building up and all of these unity and partnership words, and we turn it into something that it's not supposed to be. You know, this is an incredibly high calling for husbands. You know, Jesus gave up his life, and then, you know, Paul says, we're supposed to sacrifice in the same way. And I wrote this somewhat jokingly, but I do think we've got to look at this passage differently. We've got to see this as like, this is a challenging passage to husbands, and I don't think we always see it that way, or we have always used it that way. And then there's this tag here at the end. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And I will point out, Paul was was trained under Jewish rabbis, and the most famous Jewish rabbis. If someone trained in that setting quotes some part of the Old Testament, he's saying not just this one particular thing. He's saying, go back and look where that is. This is the end of the Genesis 2 account of the creation, where, God said, the man's here alone. This is not good. I'm going to make a helper for him. I'm going to make a partner for him. And I've got to think this is what Paul is trying to call back to here. And then this piece at the end, just sort of wrapping everything up with, husbands, love your wife, wives, respect your husbands. And, I think sometimes, even after, all of these years, that's the thing I want the most, is I want to feel respected. And so, that's not to say everybody is like that, or that's the only thing. But like I said, I just think that's this as the capstone for submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, is that's the bookend for this whole piece. I think if we think of it in those terms, let's start there, and then let's try to answer some of the more difficult questions that come up with that. So again, just sort of wrapping up this section, he does mention there's a connection here, but talking about marriage, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. I think something to ponder, something to think about. I mentioned the Genesis passage. And again, like I said, I think what this is a story of partnership. And that's how I'd like us to think through that. So that's the main section. There's a couple little pieces left, but didn't want to stop here as well for some questions.
So there are no questions from the public, let's say, about this. I have personally a question. So and I think we have talked a little bit more personally on this. So if there is a situation in which there is a decision that needs to be made, it's not affordable to leave it not to be made, husband and wife disagree on what to be done, they listen respectfully to each other, they take advice, they pray about it, they do everything as perfectly as any human being can do, and yet at the end of it they still disagree. One decision has to be made one way or another. Who has the final word, and who has the final authority in that way biblically?
I will say, again, we've had decisions about Chris joined the Navy. Where were we going to move? Were we going to accept orders overseas? When is the right time to try to start a family? When do we, most of you know this, when do we give up on that and try to start the adoption process? As our first choice country the program was shut down, we had to choose a separate country, or second, a second program. There was the decision of whether I would go back to graduate school. When is the right time for Chris to get out of the Navy? Where do we move after that? When's the right time to pursue a second adoption? Whether to, take a particular job, even though it's going to, move one of us away from our family. All of those decisions started, almost all of those started with one of us with one idea, one of us with another, with a different idea. And we talk, we pray, we listen, and we work through it. I'm trying to, if I'm the one that's not sure, then I need to make sure, what am I hesitant about? What am I worried about? What am I worried that's going to happen? What are my, what are my wife's concerns? Why does she want to do this? Why does she think this is a good idea? Why is it now? Why does she think this is a bad idea? And, we work through those, and sometimes it's, sometimes it's just, I'm just not comfortable with, I think the cons outweigh the pros on this particular decision. And in talking about it, we came to a consensus.
That I agree, and I hope
I can't. I mean, if I'm giving advice to any other married couple, it's going to be, I think, do you have the right to say I have the final say? Okay. Is it worth that? Is that going to cause harm? Is that going to, is that going to cause problems down the road? I think that there's a lot of things in that. I just think, like I said, I understand where you're coming from in your question. I just think, again, Chris and I've been married 25 years, and we've gone through a lot of different things. And this is not how we approach decisions. So,
as I said, that is not usual. As I said, in 99.9%, hopefully that's exactly how things will be resolved and should be resolved in a Christian marriage. But occasionally, I'm sure life is very long, there will be times of real disagreement and a decision that somehow will need to be made. And there will need to be one of the two who will have to make a final word. And that was the question, not what is the usual state of being, because the usual, of course, I agree 100%. That is exactly how it should be.
I just think if that's where you are, and through whatever advice process you've gone through and all of the people that you've gotten to help you, and you're trying to make a case for, hey, I think this is what we should do, and and your wife still has like, I think this is a bad idea, then I don't think it's wise to pursue that.
Okay.
I mean, that's, like I said,
I don't see any other questions here specifically, even though somebody was saying that there was some person who had a question at the beginning. If that person has that question or not, they can write to me personally, and maybe I can ask it later.
Okay.
Right, we can move on.
Okay, so another section. So again, like I point out, here obey is used. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. One of the things I really appreciate about this passage is it doesn't, like if you've grown up in the church, you've heard obey the first time as a thing you say to kids, and we did that as well, and I think that's that's appropriate. What I appreciate about this is it's not just children obey your parents, but there's a reason attached to it, because there's a promise from God that you will be taken care of if you take this course of action. And again, it's there's a spiritual connection to it. It's not, just because you'll be rewarded, or because, there's a, like I said, there's a, a promise from God attached to that, and not just, a reward from your parents. And that, honoring, that's again, it's a high calling attached to that. Culturally, this probably would have also applied to, if you have a household, then that's the oldest, the oldest male, and then sort of everybody else attached to that family is all sort of living in the same thing. Does this still apply to, apply to me, to my parents? I think there's certainly some, some connection to it. Is it have to? I'm not necessarily sure that's the right way to look at it. The corresponding piece, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And again, this is a piece that's not in the, it's not in the, lost train of thought, sorry. I'll take that as a, to talk about that. So again, you're reading through this, stuff that kind of comes out. Children obey your parents, but fathers don't exasperate. Mothers, I think, mothers are perfect. It's probably not what he means, but I do think some of the, who things are addressed to, I think there's something to that. What I would say, as a parent to other parents, be careful with your expectations. What are your kids' strengths? What are they good at? Not saying ignore things they're not saying ignore their weaknesses, or don't try to strengthen those. But if all you're confronted with all the time is, here's what you're not good at, here's what you're not good at, here's what you're not good at, and that's hard. And this is something we've tried to do with our kids as well, is find things they're good at, and try to encourage those things and celebrate those things, and celebrate those whatever those wins look like to them. And balance is important. I'm a former teacher. I'm not going to say education is not important. I'm not going to say grades aren't important. But sometimes we get out of balance with where they should be. What is that? What's the right one? And wisdom and prayer and advice, I think, are all great things there. And just to remind, like, everyone's different. If you have several children, they are almost certainly not going to be the same. They're going to have strengths and weaknesses, and just try to remember, try to be careful with why don't you do that like your brother does, or like your sister does. So I think we'll continue on. There's this last piece here, and then we'll have sort of final questions. So there's a last piece here, and it's difficult to for us to sort of approach this and even interact with this. What does this section really mean? Several people that have written about this have commented that ancient slavery and anything slavery after 1600s or so, they're just not the same. They really should be different words. I think is how Scott put it one time we were talking about this. They really aren't the same things. There's a couple things I think I did mention and specific differences. If that's not in a later slide, then I'll call it out at some point. But again, obey is used here, but not in with submit in a different place. And the thing I'll call it here, just the not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. I mean, that's powerful. I mean, that would be incredibly difficult to do. But there's some spiritual power behind some of these things. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. And again, there's direction on the other side. This was not common to call out. Hey, also, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. You have to sort of go back. What does he mean by the same way? Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both master, their master, and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So, like I mentioned, the ancient slavery was a very different thing. A couple of things I'll point out: there wasn't a visibly distinctive group who could be assumed to be slaves. Slaves in Greek and Greco-Roman time frame were generally educated. In some cases, were well educated, and sometimes were like what their job was to be sort of the teacher for the children of that household. Ancient slaves, this was common enough that there were restrictions eventually placed on what fraction or how many slaves a master could free, either each year or on their, when the master died, a certain percentage or certain group of them would be automatically freed. So again, there's just, there's some differences in that. And I'm not sure this is a totally accurate statement, but it's a good piece of this was more of an economic thing. And in some cases, like a family would, would, sell's not the right term, but would have one of their children become a slave because it was an opportunity as they grew up, that now they could have, an opportunity that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that, like I said, these are just, these are different things and sort of what we think of. This particular passage, I mean, there's a history of this being used to justify slavery. American churches did it. Pieces of this and and other things as well were used to justify segregation. This has been used for a lot of bad things, not just by bad people, but by churches as well. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And some of these ideas are still around today. I've heard a couple people talk about sort of recent conversations they've had with people where people have mentioned oh, that's the mark of Cain, or the mark of Noah's son that I'm blanking on. And it's just that's not a correct picture. So what do we do? Like I said, it's difficult for us to even sort of interact with this particular thing. Why didn't Paul just say, hey, this is wrong, stop it? We don't know. I think part of it was he didn't have the authority to do that. I mean, like there's some things he was willing to work with in terms of culture, and some things maybe he felt like he would. I don't, again, there's some of these questions I don't necessarily have answers for. I think it's helpful for us to think about those. Just some other questions I'll throw out. Are there jobs that you look down on? Does this apply to employee and employee, or managers and things like that? In some ways, maybe. I think these are these are some questions that we can I think are good to think through. So in sort of wrapping up all of these different sections, a couple things I read pointed out, these aren't all of our relationships. There's only sort of a handful. It doesn't talk about, your brothers and sisters, how you're supposed to deal with them. Groups of men, groups of women, whatever. We're not told from this how to deal with that, but I do think, again, the default piece of submit to one another. Everything that's mentioned here, a couple things. One, there were common household codes. They included these three sort of divisions. And so I think Paul is directly speaking to the culture of the day to say, hey, you've got some things wrong. And I'm going to add, I'm going to push you to be more like Jesus. I think, again, as a question, are you in a position of authority? Are you a manager? Are you a boss? Do you own a company? I think there's some important lessons in there as well. How are you, how do you use that authority? Some final questions, and then we'll probably wrap this up. This is, with almost everything in the Bible, this is a tricky question. Which part of this is just the culture of the day? What part of this is sort of meant for all time? Those are always hard questions, and I think they're worth looking into and worth thinking about and praying through and studying and talking through. But they're, it's always a difficult question. How does what Paul's doing and his charges, how do those challenge the culture of the time? Doesn't address singles at all. How are you supposed to relate to the world? I think is an important question to think about and not just, and not forget about. Are we supposed to look at, is this just the household? Is this how the church is supposed to work? A lot of churches were house churches. Is there something in there? I think that's worth exploring as well. So I think I'm going to skip over this part for time. It's in the slides. I think there's some, there's some questions in there. Some of them are a little bit duplicated, but I said in sort of closing stuff. I think the most clear thing of what applies to all time or what applies to the largest situation, I think is what he started with, that the call to submit to one another. And it's important that people in leadership or authority positions be careful about the influence that they have, and again, imitate Jesus. So there's some wrapping up pieces. Again, that'll be in the thing, and then I guess we'll close this out in, it sounds like, a couple of weeks. So final questions. Appreciate your patience. I know this went somewhat on the long side, but
there are a lot of comments more than questions, but there is a question, specifically as a question. The question says that in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, Peter is quoting in an approvingly way, and is giving it as an example to Christians, saying this. It says, for this is the way that the holy women in the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. And the question of, I don't know who asked it, said, I don't think that Sarah would have had any problem with her husband leading the way in a decision. Is American culture clouding our convictions about husbands as leaders?
So there's several things in that piece. And I mean, you know, like I said, I'm not really trying to say that I'm not saying you can't make decisions that way. I just don't think that's just not how I've ever approached it. In terms of, you know, in terms of the other part, I mean, there's cultural pieces in there, and those are difficult to try to map through what is being, you know, what is being said, what is being, you know, what was it, you know, both. So that in that case, both for Sarah and also for Peter's audience, and also today, those are three separate cultures. And you know, is there a one right answer for all of these? It depends on, you know, it depends on the situation. You know, I don't disagree with that point, but I think it's, you know, I think you do have to be careful of, you know, looking at what is this actually saying, and not, you know, and also what is it not saying.
You know, Brian, if I could add to that, that question reference to Sarah is a great question, but limited in the sense that we got to remember that God was both and Abraham admit. First, secondly, it says, and then it says how to admit.
Scott,
Yeah.
you're breaking up. We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Why? Can you better now? Check something.
No, your connection, it seems it might be poor because we missed like 10 words out of it.
I can't work. I don't know better now. But the chapters about in for the whole first you know, chapters 1 and 3, and it is, there are natural things. It is to had to is what chapter talks about. Talks about us, the governing authorities. Talks about us.
I'm sorry, we are not hearing anything coherent to this because
Okay.
It's all interrupted. Sorry about that.
Okay, let's, you think I should go ahead and close out now?